Yeah, my research title is, Sharpen, take a breath, Regulations Affecting the Welfare of Children in High Conflict Separations, including Parental Alienation in Irish Family Law. It's gone from almost being nowhere in policy and procedure, but it's been in the background, like 3 years ago, into being front and centre. Although ironically, the High Court has been dealing with cases, and I've done an analysis of the case law there, since 2011. There's quite a few High Court cases which have cited parental alienation and had to deal with it in the absence of formal legislation. Well, the problem comes up through the courts, and there's multiple approaches, and then we realize there's an issue to be dealt with here, and now we've stepped back and taken a kind of a strategic approach towards it and built in a policy. So that's a reasonable approach, I suppose. The advantages we're publishing in the English language, so it gets found, but one of the papers I used was a Dutch paper where the Dutch government did something similar about 3 years ago. In England and Wales, the president of the Family Law Court, he's taken a different approach where there are cases of note with an important point of law, and he's done this with several cases of parental alienation. They've anonymized them and then published them, and that's the policy of Lord Justice McFarlane. And so that's a good approach, because they're then reported in the academic journals and the legal journals. But it's kind of a policy by the back door. There's not a public policy necessarily. There's been discussion in Parliament in the UK. So governments are doing things around this, but I think, the Irish approach and is quite strategic, and that's good. It's unfortunately slow when you start to do things that way at government level. There are some who say, oh, this is controversial, and they start to put labels on it like pseudoscience and whatever like this. And that's just bizarre, because it's child abuse, and it's recognized by the Child Protection Agency as child abuse, and it's a form of coercive control, which we have legislated for. But there does seem to be, a denier pressure groups that are trying to shut down conversation around this. When I'm talking with my colleagues around this, who and people who are involved get easily triggered by this kind of thing. But if you look back I compare it to like the vaccination and the anti-vax people. You're never going to convert them. They're just sold on the thing. And even climate change deniers, it doesn't matter how much science you have on the thing and how much policy you have on the thing. There are some people who will, and very prominent people, who will come out and just totally deny the thing. And even I refer people back to like the Spotlight movie, which talks about it's the story of the Boston Globe team when they started to look into the clerical child abuse. Was it just the odd priest or whatever? And people knew about that, it turns out, but it just wasn't coming out. And then when it came out, everybody had known about it all along. And I think this is, some parallels there between that, to say to people, we don't have all the solutions now, but we're going along a process where we're starting to recognize the issue and starting to put the protections in place. And some people are obviously going to be upset by that. We don't have a CPS. It's an organization called Tusla, which is formerly the Child and Family Agency. They talk about abuse as 4 types of abuse. So there's physical and sexual and neglect and emotional abuse. And emotional abuse, as they say, is one of the hardest to work with and detect, and there formerly wasn't training in certain areas, such as parental alienation. So they recognize family conflict and the involvement of children in family conflict, ongoing family conflict, as a red flag towards emotional abuse. We're working with them around developing that and training for that and language around that and an engagement program around that. So there's movement, but then they had to wait for what was the government policy. They couldn't move independent of government. So now government has published. Hopefully we'll start to move a bit quicker on that. There's 2 separate treaties there. So one is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that's the most signed up treaty in the world, and it has developed over time. And they're looking at a bigger picture, so this is one thing, and what's happening with the family courts and the voice of the child and child protection was discussed without actually using the terms parental alienation, because some people will just shy away from that. Then there is also the European Convention on Human Rights, which applies to many European countries, including non-EU and so on. that has a number of articles in it around family life, particularly Article 8. And historically, that was to protect families from state involvement. But the case law and the jurisprudence in that has evolved, where they're saying now that states have a positive obligation to intervene to protect family life. And that's an interesting development. And there's a very recent, relatively recent case in legal terms, IS and others, and Malta from 2020, that very much reminds states that they have positive obligations to protect the children and to intervene, even if the parents aren't cooperating. That doesn't get the states off the hook in terms of their obligations. When a country goes before the European Court of Human Rights and loses, now it's not an appeal court, you go through up to your own domestic court, and if you feel your human rights haven't been sorted by that, then you go to the European Court of Human Rights, and they can award you money damages, but the big win really is that they are like naming and shaming the country, and the country recognises then that to avoid being taken there again, they need to do something to resolve. So there's 18 cases in the European Court of Human Rights citing parental alienation, and then there's more citing behaviours that are effectively alienating behaviours, but they don't use the term. So now there is clear that the European Court of Human Rights is putting an obligation on states to positively intervene to protect families in these kind of situations. It's a slow process, but we're getting there, I think. In the Irish position, there is that legislation that says that the courts will have to take judicial notice of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. And the same legislation also says that government bodies and government agencies have to conduct their business in line with the European Convention of Human Rights. But the Irish system, it's a big problem that we have an adversarial system as well. So the same thing would happen in Ireland, maybe not as aggressive as the Americans, but it's like if you don't have a problem going into court, you'll definitely have a problem when you come out. And one of the things that the critics say is there's no agreed definition. There are definitions and people use slightly different variations on them, but that's the same as like, what's the definition of child abuse? In Irish law, there's no definition of domestic violence because it's a bigger thing and more things can be argued in court. And if you start regulating it, they can say, well, this behavior isn't domestic violence because it's not in the code. We implemented a criminal offence of coercive control, but the definition says coercive control is something that a reasonable person would think is coercive and controlling. So it's like, yeah, that's not much of a definition really. But parental alienation could be implemented exactly the same way, as that parental alienation is behaviors by a parent that appear to be alienating. And that would be the exact same. So we could use coercive control as the exact same model, mild, medium, and severe. And some children are just at the early stages, and if you could stop it then, that would be fine. And we've met cases here where it's completely severe, where the children are totally poisoned against the parent. And people go up and down that scale. So, some children will go into more alienated and then will come back if contact is restored. So people say it's a complex topic, which it is, and definitely a form of child abuse. It has to be. And it's a form of coercive control, and it's a form of intimate partner violence. Are there agreed definitions for all of those? People use a lot of different terms for them, so that doesn't mean they don't exist.